to the eye. Your heart beats against mine and our breathing aligns as we do our sacred dance around the dark bedroom sheets soaked from the guava nectar you withdrew from our flower, all because this night you took the step to pollinate under the stars, under the moon, under my haven. And I've fallen for the look you seeped into my soul. How do I feel a love I've never felt? From a soul I have yet to see developed, yet you opened every part of me. Whole, no blocks, no obstacles. And I am the only wet distraction you've entered. Moans yearn for ears, and my arms pull you near, and I whisper nasty promises that make you go deeper, harder, and my eyes are in the back of my head. Your name is a new religion flowing from my mouth. I tasted and felt you were so good. Sinful I am, but you became covered in my juices of a new communion.
So this right here is the story behind The Garden by Brodie Dharma, right? Now, the story behind The Garden by Brodie Dharma featuring Genesis. And her name is very fitting for this particular song because I was in a space where I began my sexual shadow work back in 2016, right? I was in a relationship that started in 2013. And this relationship that started around 2013 was one that started when I was 17 years old. And in early 2014, I decided that I wanted to go celibate or abstinent for religious reasons, right? I remember I was going through a process of my own spiritual journey, my own religious journey, and I came across fear-mongering videos saying that Christians could go to hell for fornication or premarital sex. Now, during 2015, I had a mental break, and this mental break was because the pressure of being celibate or abstinent was too strong for me. I'm just a younger version of my father, and my father is a great man, like one of the greatest men I've ever met. And he's currently 50 years old, and he's never been married. And I was thinking to myself, like, damn, I don't know how this is gonna work, because the only woman I could ever see myself truly marrying that I've ever met was the woman I was dating when I was 17 years old. So when we had a breakup in 2015, this was around the time where I was listening to very fear-mongering, demonic warfare type of Christianity teaching. And around that time, during 2014, when we first went celibate, what we used to do was to use this loophole of acting as if oral sex wasn't sex, right? And through using this loophole, we would keep engaging and going through this process, this cycle of spending time together, using plausible deniability, getting too close to one another, slipping up and giving each other head. Then we'll do this for a couple of weeks or a few weeks, and then one or both of us would feel guilty. Then after one or both of us would feel guilty, we would stop. We would rededicate ourselves. We'd go extra hard in church. We would implement some boundaries. Then over time, those boundaries would become eroded. And once those boundaries would become eroded, it was like rinse, wash, and repeat, fall back into it. And we would do this probably from about the time of May 2014 up until November 2014. And at this time, she felt like God was saying to her, if we ever slipped up again, that he wouldn't bless our relationship and our marriage or whatever it was that we were planning to have later on in life. So at that point, I went really hard on making sure the boundaries were in place to make sure that we weren't slipping up into premarital sexual contact anymore. So when 2015 came along, I remember I was watching these videos about the topic of oral sex and how that was just a sin even in marriage. Because one thing I've learned about Christianity is that even things that are not sins, if you go looking for understanding about something, everything's going to be a sin, right? Because there are going to be people who will find ways to make anything a sin and to make anything wrong. This is just the truth of the matter. So in 2015, I had a mental break. And during that mental break, it was a situation where I ended up having a fling with a woman through over the course of the summer of 2015, after me and the woman I was with had a breakup. And we broke up because I wanted to get certain things together. But during that time of wanting to get certain things together, I really wanted some head. All right, I'm going to keep it a buck with you. And I couldn't keep up with being celibate anymore. It was too difficult for me. So over the course of that summer, I had a fling. And after this fling, we got back together. And when we got back together, this time we had boundaries in place. We were a little bit older. And when we got back together, we didn't have any more slip-ups. No more slip-ups, right? And I recognized the weight and the pressure of being celibate and how this could negatively affect my psyche and how it made it more difficult to actually be celibate. And as I was heading into 2015, 2016, I started feeling myself developing, or at least exacerbating, a pre-existing Madonna whore complex, where I began to desexualize the woman who I loved, and the woman around me began to become much more and more sexually appealing. And it didn't help the fact that the way she dealt with her sexual repression was through binge eating and overeating, and this would cause her to gain weight. And the way I dealt with my sexual repression was that it exacerbated a porn addiction in me. So as 2016 came around, I began to study more and more into a shift in my own perspective of Christianity. This came through studying Romans 5 and Romans 7 through 8, where it would discuss what I consider psychological reactance or resistance. The things I don't want to do, I do. The things I want to do, I don't do. When I do good, evil is always present. When I do evil, good is always present. And this moved its way forward into Romans 8:1, saying, now there is therefore no condemnation of those who are in Christ Jesus. And then I moved it back to Romans 5, where it talked about the law came so that sin would abound. And this concept to me really brought me in mind of thinking about the Garden of Eden, right? How the law is really a type and shadow and an expression of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Meaning that when we live our lives through this perspective of what's good versus what's evil, rather than having an integrated mentality, then it creates this push and pull on our egos, on our consciousness, on our conscious. And through this push and pull on our egos and on our conscious, we find ourselves in a position where there's this constant internal tug of war, right? Of either giving into our quote unquote flesh to our detriment. And I no longer view the flesh as just the physical body, but giving into our urges and our base nature versus suppressing and repressing those urges and that base nature. And by doing this, it creates this seesaw effect of what I consider repressing the shadow, or repressing the shadow to the point where you become possessed by the shadow, right? So in 2016, I had made a shift from listening to some of the preachers that I was listening to. Like throughout my journey, I probably started off more so at 10. It was just a simple gospel. Like I said the prayer, I believed it. And when I believed, that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin birth, lived a sinless life, died and crucified on the cross, and was resurrected on the third day, and then met people, told them the truth, and then went up to be seated at the right hand of the Father. When I believed this and I said that prayer, it was a situation for me in which I believed it and I was saved right then on the spot. I was 10 years old. And it's really funny how it occurred. This occurred through me being at my grandmother's house, an older black grandmother, and she would have all these angel dolls around the house, and the house was like weirdly lit because of the the blinds and the curtains, so it's just like the house was real spooky looking. And I was watching horror movies that day by myself. I figured I'm a big boy now, because I had some trauma in my life earlier on from watching zombie movies. It's one of my biggest fears at the time. And I watched 28 Days Later, which was a movie that initially traumatized me, those running zombies, right? And then afterwards, I watched 28 Weeks Later, and I watched Cabin Fever, and I watched When I See You, the music video, when it first came out. And all three of those things became little slight triggers for me from that day on. Like, I didn't even like that song for a long time, right? And I was so scared that I was shaking that night when I was trying to go to sleep. And I just told God, like, I didn't want to be sleepy. I didn't want to be scary anymore. I couldn't sleep. So after that, I was saved. My fear was taken away in that moment. And after that point, I didn't think too much about spirituality like that. You know, my grandmother would watch like Daystar or TBN or CBN or whatever it is, the name of those gospel channels. And I would just hear her watching them. Then I remember when I was about 13, I would watch it from time to time. And then I remember seeing Joseph Prince. And when I would listen to Joseph Prince, and he would talk about how, you know, once you're saved, you know, once saved, always saved, that particular doctrine. And that just resonated with me, and it gave me more confidence in my relationship with God. But it wasn't something I put a lot of effort into, right? It was just something that I believed in and had it in my heart. So as I started moving forward in my life, I would, you know, see what my grandmother was watching from time to time. I would watch Sid Roth's It's Supernatural, and I would get really into seeing these particular stories about people having visions of heaven and visions of hell, and, you know, aliens and Nephilim and all these different things. And I didn't get too deep into that, but I would just watch Sid Roth's It's Supernatural, and I used to love that show. I think it used to come on Daystar or whatever, and I don't remember the exact name of the channel. But as time moved forward, I ended up being, I think, around 16 years old. I started getting heavy into apologetics. So when I started getting heavy into apologetics, I would listen to people like Rob Skiba, rest in peace to Rob Skiba. I would listen to Trey Smith, right? I used to love Trey Smith. And I would listen to these videos where they would break down the history of the world's religions, where you would see people like the unholy trinity, right? Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz, which would be Isis, Osiris, and Horus, which would be, you know, Gilgamesh, and breaking down all of these stories, and then the history of the pre-Diluvian age, right? The age before the flood. And this became so fascinating to me to listen to these stories of what took place after the Garden of Eden, where you would have the Genesis 6 story, where the Watchers, or the 200 angels who came from heaven to watch over mankind, which a lot of people would also view as the Anunnaki, right? And then the Anunnaki came down and mated with human beings and taught extraterrestrial, or the secrets of heaven. You know, you have Azazel, you have Semyaza, you know, you have all these different watchers who came, and then they would mate with women, and mate with women they would create giants, and then through genetic mutation and genetic engineering, creating chimeras, teaching advanced technology to civilizations, and through this process establishing the occult schools of knowledge. And I got really heavy into things like the Book of Enoch. This is about 16, 17 years old, maybe 16, maybe 17. And I think more so around 17 years old, I started getting heavy into, and I loved Rob Skiba, you know, also canopy theory, these different things. But when I was around 16, 17, I started getting more into wanting to have these supernatural experiences, wanting to shift my perspective from only focusing on the historical aspect of it, because I got heavy in apologetics. So when I was about 16, 17 years old, I started watching videos like from John Todd or G. Craig Lewis videos, where they would talk about, you know, this was big during the Illuminati phase, where everybody was real big on the Illuminati stuff and music industry shit. And then I would listen to like John Todd videos about witchcraft in the music industry. And Then I would listen to G. Craig Lewis videos where he would get into hip hop. And through these stories of people selling their souls to the devil, I'd really think about this stuff, and I'd be like, well, can a Christian really sell their soul? And then I would start getting into watching these, and this was around the demonic warfare time, but I started getting back into that a little bit later on. But I saw some videos of hell visions, typically from like some African pastors and preachers, and they would say Christians would be in hell, right? Or that celebrities would be in hell and all different type of stuff like that. And they started, having certain scriptures that they would put in that would convince me, I believe, like Hebrews 10 or something like that. And this put a shock to my system when I was about maybe 17 years old or just turned 18 years old. And after that period of time, when I was like 18, and I was convinced that, man, maybe a Christian can lose their salvation. This is when I got heavy into a very works-based salvation mentality. And during this period of my life, I was listening to people like Chris LaSala, right? Heavy on the demonic warfare. I was listening to people like, what do you call it? I was listening to people like Warning the People. I would listen to people like Fellowship of the Martyrs. I don't think he was the most work salvation of them, but it was certain people I would listen to as far as on YouTube. A lot of my journey took place through just watching stuff on YouTube. So it's fun to me to be a YouTuber now. And they would just push this idea that your faith in God is displayed by a lack of sin. If you're sinning, if you're doing anything that's considered a sin at all, then that means that you're not really saved. So it's like you ask Jesus to take the sin away. So I would just be fighting internally with my quote unquote fleshly desires. And, when I was about 18 years old, 17, 18, is when I really decided, like, okay, I want to really dedicate myself to trying as hard as I can to live a sinless life. So when I was about 18, man, I decided to stop having sex. I had a girlfriend at the time. I said, listen, we're not having sex anymore. If you want to leave, if that's what you want to keep doing, you can do that. But if not, you can stay. And if you want to stay, just understand that we're going to be celibate. And she decided to stick by me, right? And when she decided to stick by me, that's when, we would go through that process of, that cycle of plausible deniability, temptation, falling into it, rededication, rinse, wash, and repeat. Falling into it, then guilt, then rededication, then, rinse, wash, and repeat. And when it got around to 2015, this is when I was heavy on the demonic warfare side. I used to be somebody who would evangelize and walk around just saying I want to be about my Father's business and just leave the house at random and go walk down the street and evangelize to people. Or I would, cast out demons and different things like that. These are just real life experiences for me. Or to pray for people and to heal people and different things like that would occur. And this is just what my life was focused on. This was what was most important to me. I remember around this time also, I stopped boxing. I was boxing at the time, but I felt like the boxing I was doing was coming from a dark place because it initially was a way of coping with a lot of the things I was going on in life. Like I used to have this hashtag on Facebook, my original Facebook page that got taken down. I used to say boxing is therapy or boxing equals therapy. So when 2015 came around and I quote unquote backslid and I had a hard time during that year, it's like I felt like the devil was whispering to me. It was like I heard something saying to me, if you sell your soul, I'll make you famous. But I also heard something saying to me, like, your father's 40 something years old. He's still not married. You have to be celibate until you're married, which means you're not having any sex. The only woman you could see yourself getting married to, you had to break up with her, so you're not with her anymore. So when we broke contact with each other and stopped speaking, it was a very stressful period of life for me. And then it was like, and even if you do get married, you can't have oral sex anymore. And listen, I love head. I'm gonna keep it a buck with you, giving and receiving. It just meant something to me, and there was some childhood trauma behind that as well. So I had a break. I broke, and when I broke, at the end of that fling, at the end of that summer, I recognized that the pressure that I put on myself to live that type of lifestyle was very difficult for me, and it wasn't helpful. And I started looking for something called pure grace, right? And innocence, and studying this concept of innocence, studying this concept of pure grace. So I started listening to different pastors. I think Greg Dickory. I don't remember the no, not Dick Gregory. But I think around this time, or in 2015, I was really listening to like Pastor Stephen Darby. I later got to meet Pastor Stephen Darby before he passed away. This is when I got really into studying about being an Israelite. And I remember I got in the news one time doing a poem of a song I wrote called Hebrew Queen. And how do I put it? Like, Pastor Stephen Darby was a great pastor for me. Actually, his sermons and his messages actually played a big part in creating changes in the lives of my parents, right? Because there's a time where my mother, and this is public information, she was hooked on drugs for a while. And it was years later when she really got heavy into Pastor Stephen Darby, but it really helped her get out of that space she was in, being hooked on drugs. Her being hooked on drugs is how I got into boxing, because, I have a old school black father. When I found out my mother was hooked on drugs and I couldn't go to Indiana to see her that summer, my father, we didn't talk about it. He just got me a puppy and and put me into boxing. I was already training in MMA at the time, so this was an outlet for my aggression. But when I started listening to Pastor Stephen Darby, he was somebody who would talk about the Nephilim. He was somebody who would talk about Marine Kingdom. He was somebody who would talk about demonic warfare. He was someone who would talk about black people in America being Israelites. He was someone who would talk about CERN. He was someone who would also talk about paganism. He would also talk about phallic worship, and he would also talk about this concept of oral sex being a sin. And that was something that I liked, because this was my first time seeing a Christian pastor actually talk about black people being Israelites. There's people on both sides of my family, and neither side being in any camp, but I grew up with my first Bible being a Bible of with black Jesus on it. So I just absolutely loved Pastor Stephen Darby. I would listen to his sermons religiously, like every day. I've always been somebody to where whatever is the philosophy that's on my mind, I'll find the philosophy or the theology that's on my mind. I'll find teachers who speak in that vein. And leading into 2016 is when I was really focused on getting deeper into grace. Because when I recognized shadow possession, when I recognized how the law came so that sin would abound, and I would also listen to Pastor Stephen Darby, something to recognize is that at different points in my life, as I entered into adulthood, I would think about several different areas of my life and how my beliefs affected it. I remember hearing someone say one time that a man who believes in an angry God is an angry man. Or I would think about typology and how the relationship between a man and his woman is symbolic of a relationship between God and mankind. So when I started making my shift in my values, I would always think about not only just what was biblically accurate, but also what would have been effective with the relationship that I had with the woman in my life. So I would listen to Pastor Stephen Darby, and this is what eventually led to me, somewhat of what eventually led to me getting into the manosphere, because he would have a lot of messages where he would talk about feminism and the Jezebel spirit. And I would recognize some of this in the woman that I was with, not too much, but I would recognize some hints of it. And this is what I would later come to see as the animus or animus possession. So throughout this process of listening to him, I remember one day listening to some of his messages, and there were certain things that he would say that to me didn't represent the pure love and grace of God. Like, he would talk about how sex and worship are one and the same, and how if God wants worship when he wants it, and that his people worshiping is like a symphony or like an orchestra. It's like a choir. And when he wants worship from you, if you're not giving him the worship he wants, he'll start taking things away from you. So it means, okay, you're not giving me my worship, well, I'm going to mess with your kids. You're not giving me my worship, I'm going to mess with your job. You're not giving me my worship, I'll mess with your money. You're not giving me my worship, I'll mess with your marriage. And to me, this just seemed like something very petty, and it was very representative of what I felt like was this petty, narcissistic type of way of viewing God in the Old Testament. And around this time, I began having this revelation of something I could call the sin-stained conscience, right? And this sin-stained conscience is the idea that, well, I'll put it like this. I would listen to different pastors, different preachers, different teachers when it came to Christianity. And within this study, what I would come to recognize and understand is that I would hear different people who would hear from God, but the message would have a completely different take, right? Sometimes I would listen to the heavily focused on demonic warfare people, and I listen to a lot of people, so I'm not even remembering everyone right now, but I will listen to like the heavily religious, heavily works-based concept, the heavily demonic warfare-based pastors and preachers who would apparently have a lot of miracles or have a lot of deliverance or have a lot of what appeared to be power in their messages, right? And when they would hear from God, it would be like, if you don't do this by here, you're going to die. Or if you don't do this by here, you're going to hell. And these would be people who dedicated their lives to God. And then I would hear other people who would make mistakes, and then God would speak to them, and what they would hear in their heart from God would be things that were more so loving, more so reassuring, would be more so empowering, would be more so pure love, pure grace, unconditional love. And what I came to the conclusion of is that the conscience, or the sin-stained conscience, filters what we hear from God. We still hear from God, right? People hear from God, but based off of our belief system and how pure our conscience is and how strongly we believe in the sacrifice of Jesus, it affects how we interpret the same stimuli or the same messages that God sends us. So I started to take this perspective of looking at things from the letters of Paul, looking at things from the New Testament, and then looking for typology, type and shadows within the Old Testament, looking at how these different things were expressed, realizing that a lot of the traditional values that we were given in traditional church or in modern Christianity weren't even biblically accurate. Like one of those things being tithes and offerings, like from Joel 3. And from this place, I ended up finding Pastor Greg Henry, and then he would be able to go not only to reinterpret just from the place of his mind, but also from a place of revelation, but also from a place of going deeper into the history and the etymology of the scriptures, going into the Greek and the Hebrew to find the original words, and then to take those definitions through Strong's Concordance to reassemble the same scriptures in the proper order, right? But to reassemble the same scriptures with the original definitions of the original words. And then from that place, a particular Bible scripture would have a completely different message. And I would watch him do this so gracefully. I remember listening to messages of like Born from Innocence, listening to messages of his mother, Greg Henry's church, right? Gospel Revolution Church. And this is where I started getting in really deep into getting back into the grace movement, or what people will consider the hyper grace movement. And I started to really separate myself from works-based theology. I began to really separate myself from demonic warfare, because I began to believe that inspiration is to be inspirited. So an unclean belief, or one that's unholy or separate from the belief in the gospel and in a belief in love, that this is what creates the unclean spirit, because to be inspired is to be inspirited, right? When you're inspirited, it's when a belief that you have, it animates your limbs into action. So I would listen to him. I would listen to Brodie Dharma. This is a pastor from South Africa. And when I would listen to these particular people, it would be this situation where, like, Brodie Dharma has this book that I read a good bit of called Jesus is the Tithe. And from this place of listening to reading Jesus is the Tithe, I would begin to recognize how many of these traditional values that we believed were traditional values were not even biblically accurate. And also I began to recognize that if the law came so that sin would abound, if these actions that the Bible tells us to take are actually actions that we should take, but that forcing ourselves to make these actions through our flesh, because I began to see the flesh as the human willpower, self-effort, and our desire to justify ourselves through our works and our willpower, which would be weak compared to what the love of God and the gospel can do. That there must be another way for me to go about acting out this, another way for me to go about acting out this celibacy, right? Because I was still absent and I was still celibate at the time. I didn't cheat on the woman I was with, but I recognized how using my willpower and using all of these things to try and force myself to be celibate was creating and or exacerbating Madonna whore complex, where I was desexualizing the woman I loved, who I really had a pure loving relationship with. But it began to make all these other women I was coming into contact with just getting into college more and more attractive and more desirable. And it began to pervert a lot of my desires. And I was able to take these perversions of my desires and to turn them into positive things, like the foot fetish. And I talk about that from time to time in my project. But it became exacerbated and began to become deviated through this process of being so repressed, right? So I began looking into the Bible, trying to find scriptures that would make this celibacy or getting married before having sex a promise rather than a law. But in the process of this, because what I was going to do was to find the scriptures that talked about why you shouldn't have sex before marriage, or that sex before marriage is a sin, right? To really break down what fornication is, not seeking a loophole, but to find encouragement. Because let's give an example. I ended up getting into the BDSM lifestyle. Why is that? Because I remember seeing the scripture that says, wives, be submissive to your husbands. And I would spend so much time in church and I would see women who are more submissive to their pastors than their husbands. I would see women who men attempt to use the scripture of submit to your husband and it wouldn't work. I would see men attempt to use the scriptures of your body is not your own, and this wouldn't work to create the desire to act out these particular actions, even though these were commands in the Bible. So what I recognized was, if I see these things as promises, then if the Bible says to be submissive to your husband, right, then that means that I must need to be dominant, right? If I want a woman to be submissive to me, that must mean I must be dominant. So oddly enough, I got into the BDSM lifestyle through my religious studies. But through this process of studying the Bible in this particular manner, I began going through the Strong's Concordance about the word fornication. And through going through the Strong's Concordance about the word fornication, I got into porneia, I got into zana, and through getting into these word studies and these etymological studies, I also went into Leviticus 18 concerning what's considered illicit sex in the Bible. And through going through Leviticus 18 about illicit sex, I would get into looking at this whole list of things and how what was considered sexual sins ranged all the way from having sex on your period to having sex with animals or closely related family members, to adultery. But having sex before being married wasn't on that list. Then I would go into, I believe, Deuteronomy 22, maybe 24, talking about how if a man were to seduce a virgin, then if he seduces that virgin, he would have to give the virgin bride price to the father because of property rights. And if this man gave the virgin bride price to the father because of property rights, and the father didn't like him, then he would be free to go. And if he gave the virgin bride price to the father and the father liked him, then he would have to be forced to marry the woman. And then I would think about the context of these things, right? It's like in modern times, one, most of these women that we're going to come across are not going to be virgins. Two, most of them are not going to be living in their father's house or under their father's authority. Three or four, it would be that these women are oftentimes providing for themselves. Five, back in those days, there was no paternity test, and there wasn't reliable birth control. So from looking at these things from these perspectives, I would look at it and be like, well, damn, looking at the context of the Bible scriptures in the Old and the New Testament, I didn't see where premarital sex was a sin. I just didn't see it. I looked in every instance of fornication I could find. And then when you look deeper into the context of the word fornication, you also find the concept of ritualistic temple prostitution, right? Ritualistic temple prostitution. So when you're looking in the book of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, this was an area that was heavy with ritualistic temple prostitution, because another definition of fornication or adultery would also be idolatry, serving other gods and worshiping other gods. So through studying these different things, I came to a conclusion that what if premarital sex is not a sin? Now, there was also in my mind the off chance that sex itself is marriage. So because I was with the woman that I was with, in my mind, it worked like this. I was the only man she had sex with since she got saved again. Since she got saved, I was the man for her, and I was the man that was with her. So for me, I had two different points of view I could look at it from. One, that premarital sex is not a sin. So that means if we're together, we love each other, we have love between each other, we have this relationship, then we're doing nothing wrong. But two, if we've already had sex and we're having sex, then that means that we're already married in a spiritual sense. And because of this, in the Bible, adultery would be a woman having sex with another man while she's either betrothed to another man, that would be fornication, or adultery while she's married to another man. So from one point of view, if we take it too deep, or we take it very deep with the whole concept of sex equaling marriage, then the man who takes a woman's virginity is her husband unless that man dies, right? And anyone else after that would be adultery. And I felt like that would be taking things a little bit too far, right? So in my mind, I looked at it like this. That was the woman I loved. That was the woman I knew I wanted to marry. We had a conversation about it, saying that this is something we knew we wanted to do. So what the song The Garden is really about is when I got to this place of innocence in my life, I was listening to a lot of Bertie Bridge. I was listening to a lot of Greg Henry. I really began to separate myself from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and to live my life through innocence. And through doing this, I really began to overcome a lot of the addictions that I had, as far as porn addiction that started to go away. Would I watch from time to time? Yeah, but they didn't have power over me anymore. A lot of things that I used to not do out of fear, they didn't have power over me anymore. And I began to have a lot more freedom in my life. I began to be a lot more normal, but my fixation and my focus was still on God. My focus was on the love of God and wanting to live out life through the love of God. So when 2016 came around, during this period of life, I really was so fixated on wanting to learn to love the woman in my life from a place of grace, from a place of pure grace and love. And when I was in this space, at this point in my life, studying the scriptures and coming to an understanding that premarital sex is not a sin, it really blew my mind, and I really began to question a lot of things. And I didn't bring it up to her initially because that was what we agreed to. I was going to leave it alone and just, try to find a way to just use the fact that I knew it wasn't a sin in order to make it easier to just stick to what we agreed to, right? But one day she came to me, right? It's like 2016, maybe around the end of the summer, or when the second semester of my junior year in college began. And during this period of time, she came to me and she told me she felt insecure and unattractive because I hadn't tried anything sexual with her in a long time. And keep in mind what I said about the sin-stained conscience. So when she came to me and said this, at first I was thinking, well, didn't God tell you that things wouldn't work out between us if we start having sex again? But in my mind, I'm like, well, God probably wasn't telling you that. That might have been the state of where your conscience was at that point in time, and that your conscience wouldn't allow you to enter into this place of innocence, into this place of grace, into this this place of innocence, this Garden of Eden with me. And from that perspective, I no longer believed what she said God told her, because I don't believe God just go sit there and tell you something that's just completely biblically inaccurate, right? So when she came to me and said this, I saw this as an opportunity to begin sharing with her the things that I had been studying, right? To share with her the things I've been studying, because we were already going through some relationship issues, and I felt like a lot of the repression played a big part in the issues we were having within our relationship, right? Because she had gained a lot of weight at the time. But during this period of time, I got to a place in my life where, since she brought it up, I saw this as an open door. I saw this as God presenting an opportunity for me. But really, she was just expressing an insecurity that she had. So soon after this, I began trying to break down the scriptures for her. I began trying to go through this process of, sharing with her what I've been exploring, sharing with her what I've been learning, so that we could walk into this place of innocence with each other, weighing out the pros and the cons, and really listing things out, really having a logical conversation. Because really, during the time when we were celibate, she had desired me more than she ever did when we weren't celibate. But as soon as I no longer believed in being celibate, a lot of that desire just immediately went away. And it was crazy how it worked, but not all of it, because soon after I came to this conclusion and we started having these conversations, we began to get back into having oral sex with each other, giving each other head, which is something I enjoyed, right? She enjoyed it as well, because I snatch her soul up, she snatched mine, we have a good time. But at this point in time, she still believed that it was wrong, and that what we were doing then was wrong as well. It's just that she was willing to do it now that the door was open for her. And really, she lost a lot of respect in my leadership and all those things in me as a spiritual leader once I no longer believed that premarital sex was a sin. So what ended up taking place from this point was that we entered into the same cycle that we previously were in back when I was 18 and we were together. And this cycle was that, we'd spend time together. There would be plausible deniability. We'd get comfortable. After she get comfortable and not feel any pressure, it might be an insecurity thing. It might be this, it might be that, whatever it is. And then from that place, from that plausible deniability, she'd initiate something or I'd initiate something. But most of the time it would be her initiating something if we said we weren't going to do something before then. And then, we'd do this for a couple of weeks, a week, couple weeks, few weeks, maybe a month, typically not a whole month. And then from that place of doing that, then she would feel guilty, or she would want to stop, or she would feel pressure. And then from that place, she would shut it down. And when she would shut it down, I was no longer in a position in my life where I felt guilty about it anymore. I came to a place of feeling pure and innocent, and like I was in the garden about these desires that I had. And when I was in this place of feeling innocent, of no longer having sexual shame about the desires I had for the woman in my life, I began to return back to the space I was initially in of being a man who had eyes for one woman. Because I have these lines in a song where I say, I learned to loosely hold to what I know until knowledge serves a purpose. It's like I wrote this song maybe a couple years or a year after we were in this space. And that's just about just esotericism, right? Or this is just about understanding that sometimes somebody's not ready for the things you have to say. I said, no, I will not impose, nor I'll decode until I feel that it's worth it, right? And I said, I'm laying next to you. When I whisper in your ear, everything feels perfect. And it all is how it appears on the surface. And some of this was wishful thinking, right? But it was a combination of real life experiences and then also this romanticized idealism of what I really desired to experience. I said, I often become bold before I explode. But, passion serves its purpose. And this is just me starting to embrace more of my shadow with my aggression, and also recognizing that for her, it would oftentimes be just taking initiative rather than wanting to have a logical conversation about things that would really do it. And this process is what led to a lot of us getting into CNC, which also played a part in me later on getting into BDSM, which was having certain CNC components within that relationship, because we would have an understanding that We could have a logical conversation that just initiating and going for it would turn her on more and she'd be more receptive. But having a logical conversation to do something that she believed was wrong would be something that oftentimes she wouldn't be there for. But my own conscience wouldn't want me to allow her to go against what she believed, right? So then I say, I'm laying next to you, and I'll say, in this garden, I found my purpose. And this is where I talk about this typology, right? This connection between sex and worship, and looking at our relationships with God and worshiping God, and those floods of emotions that would come when we have our hands up in church and we're worshiping on Sunday or worshiping at home. Because if you're really worshiping, you're doing it on your own free time. And this flood of tears, this flood of emotions that we would experience, these flood of emotions that we'd experience internally, that this would be the spiritual equivalent of what an orgasm would be during sex, right? The releasing of those inhibitions, the releasing of shame, and tapping into this power. So I'm like, and it's worship, right? But this was also making an allusion, or pretty much taking a jab at the idea of oral sex being pagan worship, and saying, well, like Sarah called Abraham Lord, you know what I mean? This is your body, this is my body. In the beginning of time, we were given this light, so let's do what we like with the lights on, right? And when you look at me and ask what you're doing to me, and that was just like that was just a reference in as many little words as I could say of like when a woman looks at you when you in her guts and she's like, why you fucking me like this? That just, it does something to me, right? And it's just one of those things where when you look at me and ask what you're doing to me, there's no shame in your eyes, and that's right on, because that shame is really what I wanted to get beyond, and I got beyond that myself. And I said, in those sounds that we make as we get face to face, connected at the waist, that's my song, right? Just the acoustics of the sounds of the macaroni noises and those slurping sounds and all that other stuff. I love it, right? And said, when we get on our knees and feast as we please and talk these different tongues, it's got my mind blown. So a lot of different lines on this project are things that would sound sacrilegious to others, but a lot of what Young Niggas, A Tale of Sexual Shadow Work is about is me going through this process of doing my shadow work and embracing things that someone with a very religious mindset would view as sacrilegious or as blasphemous, even though it wasn't blasphemous to me, right? So, then it goes back into the hook, and it's worship, right? And then I get into the third verse. I say, if this ain't love, I don't know what is. If you have flaws, I don't know it is. I mean, if you have flaws, I don't notice them, right? Because she had gotten pretty big at the time, but I had gotten so deep into focusing on the love of God and the unconditional love and Him loving us and seeing us as we are, and not seeing love as a delusion, but seeing love as God seeing us as we are and really recognizing us and seeing us as our best selves. And I began to see her in the same way, to where I would just give her a hug or a kiss, or I would just see her and I'll get bricked up. I'd just be hard. You feel me? And this was a very freeing and healing experience for me to be in that space. But in that space, we didn't actually take it all the way there for a long time. So I was like, if you have flaws, I don't notice them, right? And I'm saying, is this forever? I hope it is. But them serpents have just slithered in. And those serpents represent different things. So towards this was the end of that initial relationship where we were both celibate. And that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, this religious mindset and this repression was so heavily in her mind that she wasn't willing or able to make this evolution with me. So we spent about 10 and a half months of going through this process, right? Of being in this same cycle, right? Of plausible deniability, temptation, falling into temptation, guilt, shame, And from the guilt and shame place, rededication, then rinse, wash, and repeat. And when we were in this particular space, it was a situation where I no longer felt guilty or shame about it. So at first it was me trying to be understanding, but after a while I started to recognize different things, right? Like, okay, if I felt like this was wrong, I wouldn't do it at all, right? If I felt like it was wrong, I wouldn't be doing this shit. I don't feel like it's wrong. And I'm being patient with you as much as I can, and I'm talking to you about this stuff, but it's just not seeking in. It's not resonating with you. And when I would say, just allow God to open up your heart, like allow your eyes to be open. If this is something that's wrong, then it's wrong. But if it's something that's not wrong and I got biblical study behind it, then if you truly have an open mind about it, then we can really enjoy each other and have this experience of making love, right? So after these experiences took place, after about 10 and a half months, there would be certain occasions where I really wanted to get it in. I really wanted some head, you feel me? And I was getting sexually rejected that entire time while she was still gaining weight. And like, we'll go to my mother's wedding when I was like 21, right? Because we stayed together for a long time. Keep in mind. And went to my mother's wedding. I might have been 20, might have been 21, or just turned 21. We didn't do anything, even though we went all the way to Indianapolis. Another time we went to my auntie's house in Atlanta, went on a trip, had a good time on the trip, didn't do anything, right? And I remember there's another time where it was my 21st birthday. She bought me a Kai MPK Mini for my birthday because I'm a music producer. I really appreciated the gift. She bought me some food. We had a good time, but we didn't do anything on my birthday. And I began to recognize that within a couple weeks or a few weeks before or after these occasions, we would be at it and she'd be initiating. But on the occasions that mattered to me the most, nothing took place. And this began to rub me the wrong way. It really did, because I no longer believed that it was wrong. And when you mix the sexual rejection and the sexual inconsistency along with the narrative of what was going on, along with the fact that it took a lot of energy for me to think of a way to maintain this attraction that I had towards her, with the extra weight gain, because I told her years prior, like, I'm not into big girls. So I didn't see the effort put in for her to make changes to her mentality or mindset, or to, improve her mental health or her physical health or her spiritual health. And this became very draining and taxing on me. So over the course of about 10 and a half months, I ended up falling out of love with her. I fell out of love with her. I lost that attraction I had to her. And I started recognizing that maybe this isn't about guilt. Maybe this isn't about God. But I think it could also work similar to the idea of seeing it as a sin, but seeing sin on a sliding scale of how someone may view murder, right? Like, let's say manslaughter is a much lower sin, right? Or a much lower crime than premeditated conspiracy to commit murder, right? Or an assassination. So it's like, if it occurred in the spur of the moment with plausible deniability, then this would give enough plausible deniability in order to say this is manslaughter sex, right? So let's say head might just be aggravated assault, right? But let's say if we planned it out ahead of time, then this may be like second degree murder or first degree murder, you know what I mean? So, and then sex, that would be like first degree murder to the highest order, like conspiracy to commit murder when it came to her conscience. So it would just be about playing it as close to the line as possible, which is typically what occurs when you have a works-based mentality versus a grace-based mentality. Like, when you have a grace-based mentality, you're not really seeking to play it as close to the line as possible. You're seeking to play it as close to getting it right as possible. You know what I mean? Not necessarily getting it right, but of living from a place of love, living from a place of grace, and not focusing so much on this legalistic mentality. You're thinking of, how can I be closest to God and live this life through love and freedom, right? Because love covers a multitude of sins. But when you have this very religious and traditional, like, hindered, repressed mentality, then what you can't do just creates a taboo. And this taboo creates a desire that exacerbates. And you use your willpower to stay as close to the line of what's wrong as possible, while using the taboo of knowing that it's wrong to encourage yourself or to build up the desire, the interest to do it. So I started recognizing that within her mentality, it was a situation where she kind of just wanted what she couldn't have. You know, when we were celibate and I was standing on celibacy, she wanted me like a motherfucker, right? But as soon as I no longer wanted to be celibate, it took that desire away because there was no longer any taboo surrounding it, right, within me. And me not wanting it, or her feeling like I didn't want it, would kind of create this trigger to her self-esteem, to her ego, where she would want to prove her desirability by wanting to get a sexual rise out of me. But simply me being direct and knowing what I wanted would oftentimes create a feeling of psychological reactance and pressure, right, or resistance. So after this 10.5-month period of time, I came to her one day and I'm like, listen, I'm not giving you no ultimatum. I'm not saying I want to leave. I'm just presenting this idea to you. What do you think about being in an open relationship? If you want to stay celibate, you can, but I'm ready to start back having sex. The very next time I saw her, I was getting some head and she asked me if I had a condom. We started back having sex, and I was emotionally checked out of the relationship at the time, so I didn't get all the fulfillment I wanted out of it. And I'm not sure how much she really enjoyed it that much either at that period of time. And it was a situation where we did this for about 2.5 months. And after this 2.5 month period of time, one day she came to me, we were having a conversation, and I asked her about her beliefs, her values. I was talking about my beliefs, and oftentimes she would be kind of quiet when we would talk about it, but I asked her directly. And at this period of time, she told me, what she told me was, I still believe that it's wrong. I said, you want to stop? She's like, yeah. I said, she was basically saying that she felt like us having sex was between her and her relationship with God, and that being with me felt like it was a distraction from her relationship with God, or standing in between her and her relationship with God. And I didn't believe this thought process or this value system, but although I didn't believe it, I was like, well, that's too much pressure on me for you to feel like I'm between you and your relationship with God. I don't think you have to look at it that way. What you feed will grow and what you starve will die. You're choosing this value system that you have that's sabotaging things between us. And also, before we stopped being celibate with vaginal intercourse, I had a mentality of, listen, we don't have to jump immediately into having sex. If you open your mind up to this experience, then I'll break down these scriptures for you. But you just have to show an openness and a willingness to evolve, or the openness to see something beyond your point of view. And if you're able to do that, then we don't have to jump straight into it. I'll take time with you. We can pray about it. We can read the scriptures about it. And you can take time to get comfortable enough to feel cool with that idea. So when she sprung having sex on me in the moment, and I thought, my dumb ass thought that she actually had a change of heart or a change of mind, but really what occurred is that she felt like she was going to lose me. And that 2.5 months later, when we had that conversation, it was a situation where I felt betrayed. I felt like she took advantage of me, because we didn't have to start back having sex again immediately, but it was this unwillingness to get beyond that father complex, this animus, right? These value systems. And I felt a little betrayed. So my trust was broken for her, because I felt like if I felt like it was wrong, I wouldn't have did it, right? So when she felt like she didn't want to keep doing it, she felt like it was wrong and all these other things, and felt like I was between her and her relationship with God, I broke up with her, right? And when I broke up with her, part of it was because I didn't truly believe that marriage would solve the issues that we had, right? Because I've seen women in that position where they'll try to present this animus idea that if this logical thing or this cultural thing or this social thing, this standard was met, that they would be all opened up and they would be all ready. And then I remember, the devil will do anything he can do to get you to. I remember hearing somebody say before, the devil will do anything he can do to get you to have sex before marriage, and everything he can do to keep you from having sex afterwards. So because there were certain experiences that we hadn't had at the time because of how short our sexual life was, because she was in college in another city and I was going to school in our hometown, there are certain experiences I still wanted to have. So because of this, when I broke up with her, I recognized how sexual repression works, because I remembered the period of time I went through in 2015. And keep in mind, we probably broke up in early 2018. So when we broke up in 2018, a few weeks later, maybe 3 to 6 weeks later, I hit her up and I was like, listen, I know how hard this sexual repression can be, right? So, and I know there's a lot of bad guys out there, probably me projecting my own shadow. And I was like, listen, in my mind, I looked at it like this. This is the woman who I'm either already married to on some spiritual level, we're tied together, or it's a situation where this is a woman I would want to marry one day. But I also looked at it like there were certain experiences that I wanted to have and share with her that we hadn't yet had. And through working through my shadow, I recognized that my ego wouldn't be able to handle her having certain experiences with someone else first and then coming back to me, right? But I also recognized that taboo and feeling like she was doing something wrong or something bad was what really triggered and exacerbated her desires. And that feeling as if she wanted something she couldn't have was what really exacerbated her desires. So I set out a plan to say, okay, I don't think that this is really going to work how it is right now, but maybe if we have these sexual experiences first, this will open her up. And I was like, listen, if you need some dick, I got you. So from the time of us being broken up, and my trust was very low for her and my attraction was low for her at the time. So I was in a position in my own life where I was tired of this in and out game, right? But I brought it up to her to see if she wanted to have sex with me. So after spending 10.5 months going through these experiences of dealing with one another and all this in and out sexually, I recognized that if it wasn't me, it was just going to be someone else. That's the truth of the matter. And that it was probably just something about how she saw me, or the experiences that we shared with one another, or how she saw me based off of the place we were in life when we started our relationship, or just the fact that I was the one who brought being celibate and abstinent into our relationship, that it may have very well been a situation where it could have just been a matter of time before she would sleep with someone else and could have had all the experiences that I wanted to have with her with somebody else. So I allowed myself to be the bad guy in her story, right? The guy who she could look at as the toxic man in her life, or the bad boy, even though I knew that what I felt was that what we were doing and wasn't something I saw was wrong, even though that's how I felt about it. I knew that's how she felt about it, but I'd rather it be me than someone else. So I made a decision. It's like, okay, I'm going to learn how to play this game. Because the more I recognized that it wasn't really about her true values or beliefs, but rather her social programming or a feeling of pressure, I would just hit her up and we would do what we do. And I would recognize that anytime things went good for a few weeks of time, it was just a matter of time before she would try to switch up on me, or she'll be like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. And then as long as I'd be like, okay, it's cool, or not to react or really respond at all to it, or just to leave it alone, then give it a couple of weeks and she'll be right back around. And this became a reoccurring thing for like 1.5 years. And that's not even the end of the story. But when I get into this last verse, right, before I get into the outro or this bridge into the poem, where I say, if this ain't love, I don't know what is. If you have flaws, I don't know what it. If you have flaws, I don't notice them. Is this forever? I hope it is, right? But which is me being in that state of unconditional love. But them serpents have just slithered in, and that serpents would represent the animus, but those serpents would also represent other men's penises. Because in my mind, I looked at it like this. In the Bible, one thing that justifies divorce is adultery. So on the off chance that it was a situation in which sex did equal marriage, then how I would deal with things is I would deal with women, and I wouldn't abandon a woman until she had sex with another man, right? So with her, as long as she wasn't having sex with someone else, I would always allow her to come back to me. And from that point of view, I just didn't want to make that easy. I was like, shit, I'm gonna stick around, I'm gonna keep fucking with you, and hopefully you'll mature, or hopefully we'll have certain experiences. Hopefully you'll be able to grow and get in better shape, so I can see you can do that and grow while I'm actually in your life, so that we could get to a place where that was still the woman I loved and still the woman I knew I wanted to marry. But I knew I had to play this role of being the bad guy in her story. And it wasn't just playing a role, but sometimes this is how certain toxic relationships can start. Sometimes this is how certain somewhat narcissistic dynamics can start. You know, when you're in a position where you're giving your all to somebody, and then when you're giving your all and you're communicating and you're saying what you want, you're saying what you need, you're saying how you want things to be, and a person is just not receptive to it, and then you burn out of giving all that you have to give, and then when you burn out, you shut down naturally. It's not a game to shut down. You're just really checked out. And then when you legitimately check out, you observe that this individual is now chasing after you. You observe that this individual is now more available to you than they've ever been before. And that all the things that you wanted when you were in love with them, when you were connected to them, when you were engaging with them, all those things that you wanted for the most part are now available to you. And this can create a cycle in which you begin to recognize these games. You stop looking at things from a standpoint of being empathetic with an individual and understanding what they're going through. You start seeing all of their resistance as them simply attempting to manipulate you, right? So then you say, I'm not going to allow myself to be manipulated. I'm not going to overly communicate, because if I overly communicate, you're going to take this over communication as me being overly invested and then take advantage of me in the process. Or when I shut down, now you're available to me, but when I was open and empathetic and understanding towards you, you were shut down. So when I shut down and you're available, this is how the game start, where as long as that detachment is there from legitimately being shut down, it's like you kind of want something for all that time that you spent investing. And then when you start to get invested again, you recognize that every time you try to make a little bit more of a step forward or a little bit more of investment, they do something that hurts you, or they do something where they begin to shut down, or they try to take their foot off the gas and get complacent. So then it turns into this game of pretending to be less in love or less invested than you are in order to still get your needs met. And I think this is one way in which the narcissistic codependent relationship dynamic really starts, and how it really exacerbates, how the runner chaser, dismissive, avoidant, insecure, attached dynamic really kicks off, how it really begins this cycle that can be very karmic in nature. And through going through this experience, at the end, where I say, you know, them serpents have just slithered in, purge them, don't let them through your ear, which would represent the knowledge of good and evil, and assigning this repressive thought process to our dynamic. But it also represents the penises of other men, and other men who have the capacity, who have the lack of emotional investment, to where they would be willing and capable of manipulating her ego and her emotions. I was like, don't let them in, purge them, don't let them through your ears. Hear the truth that is spoken here, right? My love, I can't see me nor you. I'll eat that fruit and we'll both die here. And then it's like, ooh, oh my God, it's worship. And like, I was crying a little bit in the studio as I was singing it, because it really hit me, because there's some stories that take place later on in the process of this album, in the process of this project, closer towards the end, that really represent that everything that I feared in this place in my life, that I questioned, but she didn't have the actions to prove that I was right yet, or that everything that I feared could take place through that social programming that would take place if she didn't do her shadow work, were all things that really were on the helm. So I put myself back in the garden, but from the standpoint of being in the Garden of Eden, I saw things from a perspective of being like Adam with my Eve, right? So it's like she took that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and I was in that state of innocence, and rather than trusting that God would give me another woman like Adam probably could have, what I decided to do was to take the fruit myself and then to enter into this cycle of good and evil and choosing to take the role of the bad guy. And this is where a lot of my shadow work really kicked off, into going deeper into what some people would consider a villain arc, or going deeper into this idea of, playing the game. And then this is where I start getting into further parts of the process and later songs in the project, where I would start to deal with other women, because if she was going to cut me off every few weeks or every couple of months, anytime things start going good for a little while, then it's like, well, I'm not going to let you control my sex life because you're inconsistent and don't know what the fuck you want. So I'm going to start dealing with other women because, one, I want to have certain experiences. Two, I low-key want to learn these experiences so I can bring them back to you. And three, if I'm not sleeping with anybody else, I may feel a little bit more inclined towards folding and putting myself in a submissive position with you out of my desires for having my needs met. So in order to avoid that, let me put myself in these scenarios, but also just wanting to genuinely feel wanted. Because I recognize that at that point in that relationship, although she would act like it was desire, and we had this conversation some years later, and she was like, 60% of that was wanting to get back with you, and 40% of that was actually wanting to have sex. It was an ego thing. So for me, when I say, why is death so romantic? Why is death so romantic? I'd rather spend my life with you. I'd rather spend my life with you. Why is death so romantic? Why is death so romantic? I'd rather spend my life with you. I'd rather spend my life with you. Like, it's basically saying, when you take the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you die. Right? Maybe not then. Maybe not immediately after. But something dies, and what dies is the innocence of a relationship and the purity of that love within that relationship. And I try to hold on the best that I could to that innocence, to that purity. But, that's where it was. That's where it was. You feel me? So this song, The Garden, is a very deep song. And then Genesis, she comes in with her poem, which is probably my favorite feature on the entire project, right? Because she really breaks down this idea of this mixture of taboo and spiritual concepts, and really breaks down, and I've broken down listening to this poem before, because it touches me on a deep level, because that was really what I wanted her to feel about me. And there may have been times or glimpses of her feeling that way about me, but it was just in very short stints. And there were moments where she did, to a certain extent, but not all the way where I wanted it to be. And listening to this verse, or this poem that was actually written probably in like 2019, maybe 2020, it meant a lot to me when I read it, because that's how I've had women feel about me before, and that's how I wanted the woman I love to feel about me. But then she found herself in a position where it seemed like she was beginning to feel this way about someone else. And being in that position while that's still being the woman that I loved, that shit broke me inside. I'm not even gonna lie to you. Like, that shit hurt me on a very deep level. But that was really what I was afraid of. And yeah, that's what I was afraid of, like, the most. Because, I got my song, the next song in the project is Prairie Turners, where I'm talking about this particular concept, and I'm gonna make a separate video where I talk about Prairie Turners, because the poem in Prairie Turners was originally a poem that I wrote for a poetry competition at South Carolina State University. And then the voice clip was a voice clip that I sent to my father when I was going through this period of my life. And I was so spiritually minded that I was no longer any earthly good. I lost all frame of reference of logic and practicality. And I just really got emotionally overstimulated and wanted to pursue my dream and my vision of being an artist for a living. So it's a lot of things that go on with this spiritual journey. There's a lot of things that go on within these songs that really express places that I was at, philosophically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and going through this journey of my sexual shadow work. So my sexual shadow work initially was something that I had planned on being something going directly from innocence into the tree of life, directly from innocence into sharing this shadow work experience of sharing this innocence and this love and this purity and making love and having sex with the woman that I loved from a place of us both being in love with each other at the same time. But when it didn't work out that way and I recognized things within her, I started to also recognize this animus, this social programming was very prevalent within most of the women that I would come across. And I felt pretty much trapped into having to be someone who was willing to play this game, even if I was being honest about it, just in order to get my needs met. So that's really where a lot of my shadow work kicks off. And then I leave from that relationship and I enter into the hookup culture world. Then I get into, running game. I get into, the dating and sex culture, dating and sex coaching and the hookup culture world, and also get into the dark psychology when it comes to dealing with women based off of my experiences. But then this eventually leads to me becoming more refined within it, to the place of entering into a BDSM lifestyle. And as I get deeper into the project, it goes from hookup culture into recognizing the shadow world of being a side dude, or into the shadow world of bordering on things that get a little bit closer to sex work. I'm gonna be honest with you, on the side of wanting to benefit from women dealing with other men financially, or benefiting from financially from dealing with women, and then it gets to a point of bordering on a pimp mentality to, having that transition into being a Dom, a 24/7 Dom, and being into the BDSM lifestyle, to taking the things that I learned and shifting that back to recognizing the natural Dom sub dynamics within that relationship, to become a daddy Dom for the woman that I was initially with some years later, and attempting to take the things that I learned from my time in BDSM, from my time in hookup culture, from my time of being a side dude, from my time of learning to deal with women, of being a dating and sex coach, having my YouTube channel that's now over 1,000 subscribers. I love y'all. I appreciate y'all for supporting me the way that y'all have, and attempting to take the things that I learned sexually to attempt to reach those places sexually and spiritually and emotionally and mentally, to establish this relationship with the woman that I loved, and to make those things work. Because after all of those years that we had spent with each other up into pretty much the end of the project, some stuff took place, but for an entire 10 years, with maybe 6 of those years not actually being in a publicly committed relationship, that was a woman who was still sexually loyal to me. And it was pretty much a mono-poly relationship where I was emotionally committed and she was sexually committed. And as long as she could date other people, but I wouldn't date other people like that, right? So it's like, as long as I didn't get into a public relationship, and as long as she didn't get into a new sexual relationship with someone else, then we could always come back to each other. And that was just kind of how things worked for a very long time. And towards the end of the project, there's always this slight sense of urgency that would sometimes create pressure and scare her off about wanting to get things to a certain place before she would get to a certain place, where that time would come where we would either part ways for good and she would begin dealing with someone else sexually, where I may not want to take her back after that, or before whatever would happen. So that's really what a lot of this project is about. It's just my process of shadow work. So this is Coach Brodie. I'm out.